Sire, sire, the orcs are coming. King Turnus looked up, startled, as Merev the guard commander burst into his throne room. What? He stood, ignoring the panicked cries from the nobles and commanders gathered there to seek audience with him, and beckoned the commander forward. The orcs? Here? Yes, sire, the man answered. Merev was a seasoned veteran, a warrior Turnus had known since his youth, and it was shocking to see him pale and shaking. They must have come across the mountains. They are pouring onto the far side of the lake, even as we speak. Turnus brushed past the commander and strode out of the throne room, moving rapidly down the hall and up a short flight of stairs to the nearest balcony, which stood off his wife's drawing room. Leanne was in there with their daughter, Kalia, and her ladies-in-waiting, and looked up, surprised as he entered and walked right past her, Merev trailing behind him. Throwing up the windows beyond, Turnus stepped out onto the balcony and stopped, stunned. Normally from here, he had a breathtaking view of the mountains across the lake. Those were still the same, but the strip of green he usually saw between water and rock was now black, and he could see it shifting as he watched, like the ground being churned up from beneath. The horde had indeed arrived. How did this happen, he demanded of Merev, who had stepped out as well and was staring at the sight, mouth open. They must have come through Alterac. Why did Perinold not stop them cold? They must have overwhelmed him, sire, Merev answered dismissively, even in his terror showing his opinion of Altroc's king and shoulders. Those mountain passes are narrow, and a competent troop could have held the horde back, but not if they were following incompetent orders. Turnus frowned and shook his head. He shared Merev's opinion. He had never liked Perinold, who had always struck him as selfish and scheming. But Hath, Perinold's general, was a competent commander and a solid warrior in his own right. He would have assembled a solid defense, although if Perinold gave an order, even a foolish one, Hath would probably obey it. Send messengers to Alterac, he decided finally, and to the Alliance army as well, letting them know our situation. We'll find out what happened later. Turnus decided, not bothering to point out that this would require them to survive until then. First things first, rally the guards, sound the alarm, and get everyone inside the gates. We don't have much time. He glanced again across the lake, where the darkness was already creeping down the far bank and around the water. Nope, not much time at all. New scene. Pigeons were released to the other Alliance leaders and to the last known location of the Alliance army in the hinterlands. One of those pigeons flew straight to Stromgarde, and its message was quickly untied and brought straight to Thoris Trollbane, Stormguard's gruff master. What? Trollbane shouted when he'd read the message. He had been drinking ale from a heavy wooden mug, and now he hurled the mug at the far wall where it shattered, leaving a streak of ale and wood splinters down to the floor. That fool! What did he do? Let them through? Trollbane despised Perinold. Not only were they neighbors and thus rivals over borderlands, but he personally disliked the man. He was too oily, too smooth by far, but even an arrogant, overdressed idiot like Perinold should have been able to block an invading army. Perhaps not stop them completely, if the horde was as numerous as Lothar had claimed, and as subsequent reports had confirmed, they could muscle their way through regardless. At least slow them down significantly, inflict heavy damage, and ward Lordaeron early enough for them to prepare properly. With the orcs already on the plains by the lake, Tyrannus would not have much time to do much more than close his gates and brace for the first assault. Trollbane stood and began pacing. The message slip still clenched untouched in his fist. He wanted to go to his friend's aid, but wasn't sure that would be the best course of action. Tyrannus was a fine strategist, and his guards were among the finest in the land, his gates and walls strong and thick. They could hold out against the first wave, he was sure of that. The danger lay in letting the full horde roll down from the mountains and swarm capital city with sheer numbers. Damn him! Trollbane beat his fist against the army of his heavy chair as he passed it. Paranold should have held them. He should have at least warned us. He is not that incompetent. He paused mid-stride as another thought struck him. Paranold had never been enthusiastic about the alliance. He and Greymane had been the only two to resist. Trollbane remembered. He thought back to the meetings in Capital City with Lothar and Tyrannus and the others. Yes, Greymane had spurned the idea, but mainly because he boasted that Gilneas could crush anyone foolish enough to invade them. But Paranold had disliked the idea of combat. Trollbane had always thought his neighbor a coward at heart and something of a bully. He was perfectly willing to fight when he knew he held the upper hand, but he hated to engage in combat if it put him at any risk, and Paranold had been the one to suggest they try negotiating first. That fool, that traitorous little fool. Trollbane kicked his chair hard enough to send it skittering across the granite floor. He had done it, hadn't he? He had negotiated with the Horde. Trollbane knew he was right. Paranold cared nothing for the others, only for his own hide. He would happily make a deal with demons if it kept him and his own land safe. And that is exactly what he had done. It all made perfect sense now. The realization that the Horde had made it through the mountains without anyone raising the alarm, the reason Paranold had not responded or warned anyone. He had let them pass, presumably for some promise of leniency or continued autonomy after the war. Infuriated beyond words, Trollbane snatched his axe from where it hung on the column beside his chair and hacked at the table in front of him, shattering it with a single blow. "I'll kill him," he bellowed. His warriors and nobles shrank back, alarmed, and their only reaction reminded Trollbane that he was not alone, and that personal vengeance would have to wait. The war came first. "Assemble the troops," he instructed his guards. "We are going to Alterac." "But sire," his guard captain replied, "we've already sent half our troops out with the main alliance army." Trollbane frowned. "Well, there's nothing for it. Grab everyone you can find." "Are we lending them aid, sire?" one of the nobles asked. "In a manner of speaking," Trollbane replied, hefting his axe again and grinning at the man. "In a manner of speaking." Anduin Lothar raised his visor and glanced around, wiping grit and sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand as he idly drew his sword across the body of a fallen orc, cleaning the blade of the blood and gore that coated its length. "Is that the last of them, sir?" one of his soldiers asked. "I don't know, son," Lothar replied honestly, his eyes still roving the trees. "I hope so, but I wouldn't count on it." "How many of these things are there?" another soldier demanded, pulling his axe free of the orc at his feet. The small clearing was littered with bodies, not all of them orcish. It had been a nasty little skirmish, and the branches above were too close for the wild hammers to bring their griffins to bear, so it had been entirely up to Lothar and his men. They had won, but only because the small band of orcs had apparently wandered away from the rest of the orc forces. "Too many," Lothar replied absently. He grinned at his men then. "But fewer now, eh?" They smiled back, and Lothar felt a surge of pride. Some of these men were from Lordaeron, some from Stormguard, one or two from Gilneas and even Alterac, and a few had come with him from Stormwind. But over the past few weeks, they had set their regional differences aside. They were now Alliance soldiers and fought together as brothers, and he was proud of them. If the rest of the army meshed as well as this one group did, there was hope for them all, both in this war and in the peace he hoped would follow afterwards. Then he caught a flicker of movement off to one side. "Be ready," he warned, dropping his visor back down and sinking into a wary crouch, his sword rising to point toward the motion. But the figure that burst through the trees was not an orc but a human, one of his own soldiers. "Sir," the man gasped, clearly winded. He did not seem harmed, however, and his sword was still by his side. "Messages, sir." Then Lothar realized the man had a scrap of parchment in one hand and was holding it out to him. "Thank you," he said, taking the message. A soldier handed the messenger a water skin. which he gratefully accepted. But Lothar was busy reading the words scribed onto the small scrap, and the warriors around him tensed as they saw his jaw tighten beneath his helm. "What is it, sir?" one of them finally asked as Lothar glanced up, balling the parchment between finger and thumb and flicking it away like a troublesome insect. "Is there a problem?" Lothar nodded, still digesting the information he had just received. "The horde has made its way to Lordaeron," he said softly, eliciting a gasp from several soldiers. "They're probably attacking the capital even now." "What can we do?" One of the men, one of those from Lordaeron, Lothar remembered, asked urgently. "We need to set out right away." But Lothar shook his head. "There's too much distance between us," he told the soldier sadly. "We'd never reach it in time." He sighed. "No, we need to finish our work here, to make sure the orcs they left in the hinterlands are dead or driven off. We cannot allow the horde to retain a foothold here, where they could then sweep back up or down to anywhere else on the continent." His men nodded, though they did not look pleased about the prospect of wandering the woods seeking strays, while their friends and families faced the rest of the horde alone. Lothar could hardly blame them. Trallion and the rest of the Alliance army were already on their way, he assured them, making several warriors look up hopefully. "He will come to the city's aid." He gripped his sword tightly, "And when we are done, we will march to the capital city and mop up any orcs that have fled his attack." The men cheered at that, and Lothar smiled, though he still felt cold. He knew they liked the idea both of helping after all, and of the Alliance being so victorious, all that was left was the cleanup. He hoped it would be that easy. "Enough distractions," he warned his men after allowing them a few seconds. "Let's make sure there aren't any other orc bands near here, and then we'll head back to Eyrie Peak to regroup." The soldiers obediently nodded and raised their weapons, falling into rough ranks. Lothar took the lead, and together they set off into the trees again, the messenger walking in their midst. "Here they come." King Trennis glanced down and grimaced. The orc horde had crossed the lake, sharp-sighted archers assuring him they had built rough bridges, but from here it looked as if they'd simply swarmed across the water like ants, and were now rapidly approaching the city walls. He was still amazed by their sheer numbers, and from what he could see up here on the ramparts, there were massive brutes as well, easily as big as the largest of men and broader, with powerful muscles and large bestial heads. He did not see any siege weapons, at least, other than a thick log that was clearly intended for a battering ram. But the orcs carried what he thought were large hammers, axes, and thick swords, and he was sure they had ropes and grapples as well. Well, Capital City's walls were as sturdy as ever. No foe had ever breached its defenses, and Trennis was determined to maintain that record. They had not been able to prepare fully, of course. The people had been easy enough to gather, since most lived within the walls already. Livestock had been more problematic, and some animals had simply been abandoned to their fate, as had all but the smallest and most precious possessions. The guards had done their best to make sure everyone and everything was inside before closing and sealing the gates, but most people had fled with little more than the clothes on their backs, and whatever tools and other possessions they had to hand. Their homes would surely be destroyed by the horde, and Trennis knew it would take some time to rebuild them afterward, assuming they drove the orc back and were able to leave the city once more. He glanced along the ramparts, where all his guards and soldiers stood ready. So few men to defend such large walls, but most of his soldiers had marched off with Lothar and the rest of the Alliance. Nor did Trennis regret that decision. The horde had needed to be stopped, and Lothar had needed every soldier that could be spared for his army. Of course, he had not expected the horde to strike at them here, and certainly not without the Alliance forces either blocking their path or marching after them to aid in the city's defense. But even if Capital City fell, if the Alliance won in the end, it would be a small price to pay. That did not mean he was about to surrender the city, however. Trennis glanced down again and judged the orcs close enough now. He could see their tusks from here and the tassels and bones and metals that hung around many of their necks and arms and heads, clearly trophies of previous battles. Well, they would find this fight more challenging than their previous encounters. No matter what happened, the Horde would remember this fight. Hot oil, Trennis shouted, and down the line Merev and others nodded. They tipped the large cauldrons over the ramparts, letting the boiling oil pour down in sheets just beyond the walls. The leading orcs had almost reached the walls by then, and the oil spilled across them, drenching them utterly. Many screamed in pain as it burned away their flesh, and the entire front rank crumpled, writhing and twitching. A few staggered away, but most did not get up again. "Prepare more oil," Trennis ordered, and servants scurried to obey, using stout poles to lift the heavy cauldrons and carry them away. It would take time to refill the cauldrons and then reheat them and bring them back up to the ramparts, but he doubted the Horde was going anywhere. This would not be a quick skirmish or a fast conflict. It would most likely be a long siege, and he thanked the Holy Light they had sufficient stores of food and water for several weeks. Oil they would run out of after another dousing or two, but it was merely the opening move in their defense. Trennis had other tricks to show these unruly orcs who dared attack their home. New scene. Thoris Trollbane stalked across the mountains as easily as if he were one of the region's sturdy rams, his heavy hobnailed boots finding solid purchase on the rough gray granite. His men moved behind him, in mountaineering as in combat. Stromgarde was a mountain kingdom, and his children grew up learning to climb the rock faces and scale the peaks. Ahead of him lay the first of the Alterac mountain passes. Trollbane could already see figures moving through the falling snow, large, heavy-set figures, marching steadily but awkwardly. Clearly the orcs of the Horde were not accustomed to the altitude or the peaks. The passes themselves were chiseled carefully out of the mountain range for just such people, allowing trade and communication with both. For themselves, Trollbane and his people did not need such conveniences. They preferred to scale the heights wherever they wished, rather than being trapped in a long chute like the one before them. The passes were far too easy to blockade and to ambush. Gesturing to his men, Trollbane crouched, his axe at the ready. Not yet, not yet. Now, leaping over the edge, he landed solidly in the pass between two orcs, taking them by surprise. His axe flashed, carving one's head from its body, and then catching the other in the throat on the backswing. Both fell, and the orcs on either side of them stumbled and snarled, raising their own weapons. But four of Trollbane's warriors dove into the pass just then, two on either side of him, and hacked apart the next orcs in line. Then more of his men jumped down and attacked the orcs beyond those already falling, and so on. In a matter of minutes, 24 orcs lay dead, and the pass was clogged with bodies. Trollbane and his men pushed the dead orcs, already stiffening from the cold, into a single stack that rose to the top of the pass. Then he stationed 10 of his men there to guard the makeshift blockade and climb back out, taking the rest of his warriors with him. "Good," Trollbane told them as they worked their way to the north. "That's one taken care of." The next pass was less than an hour's climb away. They found that pass also crowded with marching orcs and attacked it in the same way. Trollbane could see that the orcs were fearsome warriors, large and strong and tough, but they had no experience with cold or mountains and were not used to foes leaping down on them. The second pass was taken as easily as the first, and so was the third. The fourth pass proved slightly more difficult because it was the widest of them. 4 men could walk abreast here, or 3 orcs, and so Trollbane and his soldiers jumped down 4 at a time. But soon enough it was blocked off as well, and they rolled boulders down to make sure it stayed impassable. The 5th pass was clear, at least of orcs. Trollbane found warriors stationed there, but they were human, dressed in the orange of Alterac, and they were stationed above the pass as well as within it. "Hold," one of the Alterac soldiers called out, spotting them and leveling his spear in their direction. "State your name and business here." Several of his followers rushed to support him. "Thoris Trollbane, King of Stromgarde," Trollbane replied curtly. He glared at the soldiers, though he knew they were only following orders. "Where is Perinold?" "The king is in his castle," the same soldier replied haughtily. "And you are trespassing on our lands." "And the orcs?" Trollbane asked. "Are they trespassers or guests?" "The orcs shall not pass us," another soldier declared. "We will defend this pass with our lives." "Good," Trollbane said. "Only they're not at this pass. They're at the fort south of here." That startled the soldiers. "We were told to guard here," one of them said, looking confused. "This is where they said the orcs would try to pass." "Well, they didn't," Trollbane snapped. "Fortunately, my men are blocking the other passes now, but many already made it through, to Lordaeron." One of the soldiers was older, clearly a veteran, and his face paled as that statement sank in. It was to him that Trollbane addressed his next question. "Where is Hath?" "General Hath is at the next pass, with the bulk of our forces," the soldier replied. He considered for a second, offering, "I can take you there." Trollbane knew the way, but he also knew it would be easier to get to speak with Hath if he arrived with an escort. So he nodded, and gestured for his men to follow him and the Alterac soldier. It took another hour to reach the next pass. This one was the widest path through Alterac, easily broad enough for 2 full carts to pass one another without brushing the walls, and it made good sense to station most of the soldiers to guard it off. If the orcs were going north instead of south... Trollbane spotted Hath speaking with several junior officers, but waited until the soldier who had brought them had hailed the stout general. "General Hath, sir," the man called. "Visitors from Stromgarde to see you, sir." He glanced up and frowned when he spotted Trollbane. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, moving to join them and returning the veteran's parting salute. "Your Majesty," he said gravely, nodding to Trollbane. "General." Trollbane had always liked Hath. The man was a solid soldier and a good tactician, and a decent fellow. He had always disliked fighting him, and hoped that wouldn't be necessary this time. "The orcs are pouring through your southern passes," he said bluntly. "We blocked them for you." Hath paled. "Our southern passes, you're sure?" He waved away Trollbane's nod. "Of course you are, but why? The king told me personally they would be passing to the north, not the south. That's why he set us to guard these passes instead." Trollbane glanced around them. None of the Alterac soldiers were close enough to hear him as he lowered his voice. "You're a fine soldier and a good commander, Hath," he said softly, "but you've always been a terrible liar. You knew they were heading south, didn't you?" The Alterac general sighed and nodded. Perinold made arrangements with the Horde somehow, he admitted. Free passage in exchange for protection. Trollbane nodded. That was what he had suspected. "And you went along with this?" he demanded. Hath stiffened. "We were faced with annihilation," he replied sharply. "They would have crushed us all and slaughtered our people, and there was no one to aid us." He shook his head. Perinold made the choice to protect Alterac first and foremost. What he did may not be decent, but it saved lives. "And what of the lives in Lordaeron?" Trollbane asked softly. "They will die because you allowed the Horde to pass unhindered." Hath glared at him. "They are soldiers. They know the risk. The Horde would have killed our families, our children. It's not the same." Trollbane nodded, feeling some sympathy toward the older man. "No, it is not," he agreed, "and your loyalty to your people is commendable. But if the Horde conquers Lordaeron, they will control the entire continent. What makes you think you will be safe?" Hath sighed. "I do not know," he admitted. "Their leader gave Perinold his word, but I do not know how far such a creature may be trusted." He shook his head. "I told Perinold we should abide by our oaths to the other nations, but he countermanded that. I have sworn fealty to him, and I must obey. Plus, I thought he might be right, that this might be our only chance for survival." He frowned. But survival of the race is more important than that of any one kingdom. And if we do not have our honor, we have nothing at all. He raised his chin, a stern expression settling over his features. Well, I will reclaim our honor, he declared. Then he turned and shouted at his men. Corporal, gather the men. March everyone to the southern passes at top speed. We are going to assist our Stormguard friends in defending those passes and pushing back the orc horde. But sir, the officer started to object, but Hath shouted him down. Now, soldier, he bellowed, and the officer saluted quickly and leaped to obey. Then Hath turned back to Trollbane. He is in the castle, the general said shortly. He did not have to explain who he meant. His personal guard will still be there, but there are only 20 of them. I can draw him out. But Trollbane shook his head. We do not have time to worry about him now. Besides, he pointed out, if I go there, it is an invasion. If you go, it's treason. He frowned. We will let the Alliance settle matters with Paranold later. For now, all that matters is blocking the horde. Damn it, we're too late. Turalyon reined in and stared out over the valley below. They had ridden hard, he and Khadgar, and the other cavalry members, with the troops marching along beside them. It had seemed best to pass west through the foothills of Hearthglen and then emerge north of Capital City so they could swing back down and come at the city from the wide plain behind it, where its main gates lay. Now he wasn't sure the better positioning had been worth the added travel time. Turalyon had also hoped to gather additional troops from Thoris Trollbane, but Stromgarde was simply too far out of the way. Turalyon had considered detouring, but the news that the horde had also cut through the mountains and had done so before them spurred him to keep moving instead. They had to reach Capital City in time. But now he looked down from the trailing edge of the mountain range, across the valley that fed into Lordaeron and the lake below it, and saw that he had failed. The horde was already there, spreading across the valley and around the proud city like a spray of leaves about an autumn tree. They haven't breached the walls, Ilaria pointed out, standing beside him. She and the other elves, both warriors and rangers, had kept up with the horses easily, and both she and Lorathamar Theron had come forward with him to see what lay before them. It's not too late to aid them. No, you're right, Turalyon admitted, shoving his disappointment aside and studying the situation more dispassionately. This battle is not lost yet, and with our aid, Capital City will not fall. He rubbed at his chin. This may even work to our advantage, he said softly, considering the matter more fully. The horde does not know we are here yet, and we can trap them between us. He frowned. We should let Tyrannus know we're here, though, so we can coordinate our attacks, and so he does not feel he has been abandoned. Theron nodded, eyeing the mass of orcs teeming below and beyond them. A good plan, he agreed, but how would you suggest we reach the city? No one could get past those warriors unharmed, not even an elf. Ilaria nodded. If this were a forest, I might, she admitted. But here on an open plain, there is no chance for cover. It would be suicide to attempt it. Khadgar, sitting on his horse on Turalyon's other side, grinned at the three of them. I can get across, he assured them, laughing at their expressions. With a little help, he added, glancing at a short, tattooed figure who had alighted on the rocks beside them. New scene. Sire, Tyrannus glanced up and saw a soldier shouting and pointing beyond the walls. Thinking the orcs had massed for another attack, he glanced out, following the man's gesture, but the soldier was pointing up rather than down. Tyrannus looked and almost gasped as he saw a dark figure soaring toward them. Ready, archers, he called, staring at the shape, but hold fire until my command. Something seemed strange about it. Why send a single flyer of any sort when there were thousands upon thousands of orcs smashing against the walls below? Was it a scout, a spy, or something else? The archers positioned themselves, longbows drawn and arrows nooked, and waited patiently. The shape grew closer. Now Tyrannus could see that it was a griffin, though far wilder and more beautiful than the heraldic symbol would have led him to believe. Its feathers glowed gold and violet and red in the sunlight, and its fierce head turned, bird-like, to glance around with wide golden eyes as it approached. And a figure sat upon its back, holding reins and riding a saddle as if upon a horse. The rider was big, but did not seem large enough to be an orc, and it was wearing clothing far more than the green-skinned warriors below. Tyrannus stared, and then let out a breath of relief as he caught a glimpse of Violet. That wasn't armor, it was robes, and that could only mean one thing. "Lower your weapons," he called to his archers. "It's a wizard of Dalaran." It's a wizard. The griffin swooped toward them, its mighty wings beating, and then it was overhead, circling back even as the archers turned back to watching the orcs below. The rider was clearly searching for a place to land, and finally settled on a nearby corner tower, which had a flat circle for cauldrons and ballista and signal fires. Tyrannus strode in that direction, Marev right behind him, and reached the tower just as the griffin touched down and folded its wings along its body. "Well, it's good to know I haven't forgotten how," the rider announced as he swung one leg over and dropped from the saddle. "Thank you," Tyrannus heard him murmur to the griffin, which cawed in reply. Then the wizard turned, his short white beard visible now, and Tyrannus recognized him. "Khadgar," he said, reaching out and clasping the mage's hand. "What are you doing here, and on such a creature?" "I come bearing good news," the old seeming mage replied, grinning. He looked tired, but otherwise well. "Tyrallion and his forces are just the other side of the northern valley," he informed Tyrannus, gratefully accepting a wineskin Morav offered and taking a quick swallow. "We will attack the horde from behind and draw them away from you." "Excellent!" Tyrannus clapped his hands together, pleased for the first time in days. "With the Alliance army here, we can attack them from two fronts and batter the orcs between us." "That was Tyrallion's plan," the mage agreed cheerfully. "Kurdran loaned me the use of his griffin so I could reach you and coordinate. I'm just grateful I still retain the knowledge Medivh gave me on how to handle one." "Come," Tyrannus told him. "My servants will see to the griffin. They will get it water, and I'm sure we can find something for it to eat. Let us talk about what Sir Tyrallion thinks we should do next, and how we can make these foul orcs rue the day they dared raise arms against our city." New scene. "Charge!" Tyrallion led the way, hammer held before him like a lance, spurring his horse up out of the water and onto the bank toward the massed orc army. Many of the orcs were still concentrating on the city walls, which they had yet to dent for all their ferocity, and only a few heard the sound of his horse's hooves and turned to look. One of those opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Tyrallion's hammer caught him full across the jaw, shattering it and snapping his neck from the force of the blow. The orc dropped, and Tyrallion's horse trampled him. Behind him rose the rest of the cavalry, and the foot soldiers were marching after them. Having crossed the plain north of the city, now they advanced upon the horde, which turned to meet them. And that was when the city's ballista fired, raining arrows and rocks down upon the orcs' backs. Tyrallion led his mounted soldiers into the horde's front ranks, and through them, circling around and back again. And then the city's defenders struck a second time. The orcs milled about now, unsure what to do. When they faced the city, the Alliance soldiers struck from behind. When they turned toward the soldiers, the city guards attacked them. They had yet to breach the walls, and so they couldn't retreat into the capital. But they couldn't get to the lake on the plains and the mountains without first going through the Alliance soldiers. No matter which way they turned, orcs divided. Unfortunately, the horde had bodies to spare. A row of massive orc warriors marched forward, weapons at the ready, and Tyralion was forced to pull his riders back. The elven archers released a volley of arrows that rained down upon the orcs, felling many, but the new warriors took their place at once. The orcs began throwing themselves at the Alliance army, forcing them to backpedal or to be crushed beneath the heavy orc bodies. And step by step, Tyralion found himself and his men pushed back toward the water. Once they were out of reach, half the remaining horde soldiers turned their attention back to the capital city itself. They had hurled themselves at the walls, quickly exhausting the city's supply of oil and rocks and gravel and other items to drop on attackers. The ballista could not be aimed at anyone up against the walls, not without doing more damage to the city than the invaders could, and so the orcs were now safe to scale the walls and batter at the gates. Thus far, the gates were holding, but they were taking a terrible beating, and orc warriors were reaching the ramparts and pulling themselves up and over, grinning. Most were blocked and stabbed or bashed as they reached the top, but before they could climb over. But a few made it and began attacking the guards, throwing them into disarray and leaving gaps in the wall's defenders. The first wave to climb over all died, but more followed them, and now the bodies were piling up and providing the orcs with some cover as they scaled the walls, giving them room to plant their feet and ready their weapons before attacking the guards. "This isn't working," shouted Tyralion as they backed their horses across a rough bridge the orcs must have built to traverse the lake. "We don't have enough fighters to overwhelm them like this. We need to try something else." "I'm open to suggestions," Tyralion replied, battering a lunging orc with his hammer. "Can't you use your magic against them?" "Yes, but it won't do much good," Khadgar answered, stabbing his sword into an arc that came too close. "I can kill them, but only a few at a time. I could summon a storm, but it wouldn't help, and it would leave me too drained to work more magic later." Tyralion nodded. "Let's get the men back across the lake and hold this bridge," he told his friend, brandishing his hammer again, even as he used his shield to knock an orc into the water that flowed beneath them. "Then we can wait until they've lost interest in us and attack again while their back is turned." Khadgar nodded, too busy defending himself to speak. He hoped the new plan would work, because otherwise the horde would simply burn the bridge and keep pounding on the city gates until they collapsed. And once the gates went, they were inside the city, and it would be impossible to remove. Khadgar had seen the orcs take a city once before, at Stormwind. He did not want to see that happen again. New scene. "The gates are starting to give way." Trennis shook his head as if that would make the cry go away. He was too busy to see for himself, however. An orc had climbed the wall not far from where he stood, watching the battle below, and was advancing on him now, grinning widely enough to show its sharp tusks and swinging its heavy war hammer in slow arcs. Trennis reluctantly picked up a fallen sword, painfully aware that he was no fighter. Someone appeared at his side, and he recognized Marev with some relief. The guard commander carried a long spear and jabbed at the orc, forcing him back. "You should go see the gate, sire," he said calmly, poking at the orc again. "I will handle this." On the orc's other side, Tyrannus could see several other guards approaching, two of them also armed with spears. Accepting that he was no longer needed here, Tyrannus gratefully laid down the sword and turned away. He ducked down a short flight of steps within the rampart, coming out near a small guard's armory, and from there took a narrow walkway along the hall. It ended at a short stairway, and he leaped up the steps and onto the ramparts again, but now just above the main gates. He could feel the heavy pounding even before he reached the rampart's edge, rattling his teeth and making the stones shake. And looking down, he saw them slamming a thick tree trunk against the front gates. Even from here, Tyrannus could tell they were shuddering from each impact. Shore it up, he told a young lieutenant standing nearby. Get some men and shore up the front gates. With what, sir? The young officer asked. Anything you can find, Trennis replied. He gazed out past the walls, at the untold number of orcs gathering here against him and his city. Beyond them, he saw the glitter of metal on the bridge, and knew Trollian and his forces had retreated to that distance so they could plan their next move. Trennis just hoped it was a good one.